everybody knows me, Foss, Director of School of Urban Resource Planning. Thanks for coming. Today we're basically going to do three different things. I am going to give you a short overview of how we got here. Then Charlie is going to outline his idea about what we need to do next. And then I'm going to ask Jim Murley to join us and comment on it. And then finally, I'm going to open it up to everybody to actually hopefully give you some input on the ideas that Charlie and I are going to bring forward. So, when I started thinking about this, I realized that we have really started, so this I'm calling this a quick personal perspective. It's really personal. I'm going to try to do it quick. This is our lecture series. I'm not going to talk about our lecture series because you've been there and you can go online and watch them. And by the way, all our events are online. And during my holiday break, I actually watched every single video that we have online. And I was surprised about how many of the things that we talked about today, we also talked about 3, 4, 5 years ago. So on November 19, 2007 is to me when this started. When we had this lecture, Growth Management Planning for Paradise, it was a panel. It was organized by the Eminent scholar. At that time, that was Brian Ben-Sadok, and he talked about this book. And they basically had this whole thing about Growth Management Planning for Paradise. The most interesting thing, I think, was that one of the people there was Tom Pelham. And Tom, at that point, had just started as DCA secretary. And it was really kind of interesting to hear in the afternoon the panel talk about the past, and to hear Tom talk about the future. And what he was talking about was actually very excited. He says, you only need some changes in the growth management system. We need a rural policy and we need an urban policy. And it was really kind of a good time. And I think we all thought something was going to happen. We had a secretary who really cared and was going to move this forward. The next one was February 25, 2009. When we had this lessons learned, the history of planning in Florida, and we had Richard Ravina, Earl Starnes, and Bob Graham basically talk about the history of planning in Florida. And I thought this was, for me, a really important lecture. And what was important is that although they had a very positive message, and they basically said the system is good, it's just never been funded. So don't criticize the system. For me, for the first time, it was the realization that we can't fix the system. We need something different. This is not going to be working. After that, and I'm forgetting a whole bunch of them. I'm only picking the ones that I thought had something to do with it. October 21st, 2009, Growth Management Past, Present, and Future. This time, we had Peter Hent's perspective, which was a little bit different. He clearly wasn't thrilled about the system. Peter, if I'm wrong, just tell me. He wasn't thrilled about the system, and actually I know he infuriated some of our students when he says, why do I need to protect the Everglades? But he really asked an interesting question when the students, why do we need to tell me why? He outlined the system, and the system is actually on here, and I think it's really interesting that it's not very much different, I think, from what we thought about later on. And his contribution to me were, I'm going to say it in my way, we would address the two major issues. The two major issues in planning are the networks, transportation and natural resources. November 4, 2009, David Prosperi, Henry D. Epstein Professor of Planning, gave us the 2020 lecture, which was called The Celebration of the Past, Discussion of Future Planning in South Florida. And he argued that we need to invent the South Florida region, which was really interesting. We actually need to invent what this region is. We really don't know what this region is. The most important thing is that, first of all, his lecture was, the issues were really not very different from the issues that Peter brought up. And then he said one quote that I really like. He says, the region lacks the competitive drive to become the world-class city. And to me, that's really the thing that stuck out of this whole thing. The next one was November 8, 2010, The Truth About Florida. This was a reaction to Amendment 4 and people's lack of understanding of what was going on and the little press that all this got. We had a whole bunch of, we had the 3 directors of planning programs here, the professors there, and then we also had these press here. We really asked the press, how can we get you to cover this? And their comment was, they stressed planning is not interesting news. It needs to be presented in a more consumable way so that the public wants to hear about it. Still struggling with how to do that, but I think it was really interesting. What was really important is, our poster was very unusual. As an academic, I still feel kind of uncomfortable with it. Then we had the summer class, Charlie and I did. Some of you are actually here. Rethinking Planning in Florida. To me, that was really interesting. It was intended to really talk about planning in Florida and the theory, but we ended up talking very quickly about what the future needed to be. My major lessons, and Charlie might think about this differently. Planning pictures do not, or planning documents do not paint a picture or tell a story. We need to do better. We need to communicate our ideas better. Second one, GIS creates beautiful maps, but it seems to restrict our ability to actually think. Planning is an investment in the future, not a cost. And finally, it's all about global competitiveness. Then we had one that had nothing to do with any of this rethinking planning in Florida, but I actually thought it was one very interesting thing. It was a unique opportunity to hear the commissioner of the Delta program speak. And this diagram really stuck out to me. This diagram is basically them showing how it works and what we need to do. It's the consensus building image. And it's hard to understand, but basically say, we agree on all this, we agree on this, we agree on this, we agree on this, this is what we know, this is what we know, this is what we need to work on. And it was really interesting for me to say, this is the starting point. We agree on all this stuff. We don't have to talk about it anymore. The other interesting thing is that I thought water was so important that it had to be an official that was appointed for 9 years and to try to keep it out of politics. All right. So then we had November 8, 2011, we had Michael Batty here who talked about complex cities, or complexity, and he basically said, I have two interesting quotes. Cities that are becoming even more complex, the tools that we fashion both to understand them and intervene in their design are no longer appropriate or even relevant. I left some stuff out to get a point across. The second thing he says is we now live in a world in which global and local intersect in strange and convoluted ways. Handle all this, we need to redefine what a city is and then respond to the appropriate terms. And I think that is really what we're trying to do. And we're trying to reframe this. That's what I learned over a period of 4.5 years through our lectures. And with that, I'm going to give the word to Charlie to tell us what he thought.
Thank you. We started this initiative, my involvement with FAU, under the notion of rethinking planning. And when I started, I really was focused as much as anything on the institutional challenges that I saw in how we plan, how we've planned in Florida, and what we're going to do to renovate them in the future to do a better job. And the more I've thought about it, the more we have talked about it, the more I worked with students this summer in what was a very exciting and challenging exercise, the more I've come to wonder whether what we've been doing is really directed at what we need to be doing. And so what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is some ideas about how I think we can chart a different course to give planning new meaning and a different role in the future, not only of the state, but potentially in the country. Look to the lessons of some other programs. And you're going to hear from me the words non-traditional. And by non-traditional, I mean not renovating the Regional Planning Council, not trying to make local governments be things they aren't, and not make a city council be an objective, merit-based decision-making body when their political constituents can reach out and touch them in the grocery store virtually every day. And so what I'm going to do is try to take you through my thinking. I want to make it clear that I'm an advocate of planning, have been all my career. I started out advocating, I think, the wrong position, because I started out as a zoning lawyer. And what I discovered was that zoning without planning was just an irrational exercise of political power based on who was in charge. It didn't focus on real issues. It focused on the colors that buildings were painted, how tall the buildings were, how wide the front yard or how deep the front yard were, not things that really defined whether we had made housing available to people who worked in the community in close proximity to their places of employment. And so I was a great advocate of the linkage between planning and comprehensive plan, and I embraced Charlie Harr's view that zoning without planning made no sense at all. And I hearkened back to the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act's producer, Herbert Hoover, who wrote, "I'm a firm believer in city planning as a means of eliminating waste, raising living standards, and achieving higher standards of community life. Good city planning is one of the first obligations we owe to future generation as part payment of our debts to past generations. Now, ironically, he published the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, and zoning simply pushed planning out of the vocabulary between 1926, when it was validated, zoning was validated, and really into almost the 70s. And so while zoning spread all across the country and all kinds of complex land development regulations, there was no planning predicate. And as a result, planning rarely focused on what I believe were really fundamental and substantive issues, such as shelter. And I mean that as opposed to residential development. I mean shelter to support it. I've been doing this for a little short of 40 years, and I've been pleased to be a part of what I call the good and the bad and the ugly of planning. There's some great things I've been involved in. There are a lot of things that I look back on and wonder how and why we did what we did. I firmly believe we need to do a better and different job of planning if we're going to make a difference in Florida, if we're going to do anything more than live for the moment, to try to find the quickest jobs, not the best jobs, to build a near-term economic opportunity instead of a long-term sustainable future. And I don't see how you do that in an environment which is so political unless there is some objective planning leadership that charts a course that can be a noble diagram for the future. And I am widely influenced by the Chicago Plan, which was produced not by a governmental agency, but by the Chicago Business Club or Commercial Club in 1905, and continues to serve as a basis for municipal investment. Now over 100 years after Richie Daley became mayor, one of his priorities were to complete the improvements that were in that plan. And if you read that plan, and if we use that as a guide for what we tried to do in Florida, I think you'd find that we would probably be a much better place because of its aspirational qualities, because of its relative objectivity, the nature that it wasn't focused on regulations. It was focused on what do we want to be, what can we be, and left as much to the future was how to make that happen. And it recognized that how it would happen would occur in all kinds of different ways. So this lecture and the lecture series it's a part of is a part of my desire to explore ways to make planning more effective and meaningful, and our society more efficient and competitive in the global economy. I am currently reading That Used to Be Us by Tom Friedman and Michael Mandelbaum, and it is a wonderful essay on where we are in America and what we need to be doing. I'm devastated that it has instantly dropped off the New York Times nonfiction 20 best reads because its message is really vital and important. But if Florida is going to succeed, Florida has got to get with the program, and I hope we can talk about how we can do that. I'm a big fan of Einstein's definition of insanity, and that is keep doing the same thing and hoping this time it'll turn out better. I think we need a different way, and you're going to hear some ideas I have. I intend to be provocative, which the definition in the dictionary is serving or tending to provoke, incite, or stimulate, and that's the purpose of this lecture. I don't know how many of you have read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. It's not gospel, but it's an important lesson, and when I read it, it reshaped my thinking about planning. Basically, Diamond analyzed societies, 10 different societies, and identified how societies chose to succeed and sustain themselves or to ignore the warning signs and fail and go away. And the two favorite ones of mine are the Easter Islanders and the Mayans. The Mayans, by the way, in the first 1,000 years of the first millennium AD, was a population of 20 million people living in a very sophisticated urban landscape over 150,000 square miles in Mesoamerican that basically was gone by the year 1000. And Diamond shows that there were all kinds of signs in each of these cases where the society chose to fail, that what they were doing was unsustainable. In the Easter Islands case, they lived on wood. Forests that had taken 1,000 years to deliver were used for building materials. They were used for energy. And they were consumed as the society flourished in an increasingly way. course, those trees took thousands of years and hundreds of years to replace themselves, and they were consuming them in just decades. And ultimately, all that was left were the Mori. And he chronicled the steps of how societies come together, start to flourish, begin to overconsume, begin to cannibalize the resources they've depended upon, ignore the realities. They start competing in ways instead of trying to find ways to share and work together. They often descend into war, and ultimately they collapse. And what struck me was, in thinking about what I do for a living, was that I live in a state now, Florida, where there are all kinds of signs of unsustainability. We know our water is in serious trouble. We know that we have problems with global warming. We know we have problems with mobility in South Florida, our high dependency on the private automobile. And we have this very sophisticated growth management system, and we're not addressing it. We're just pretending somebody else is going to solve this at some time. We keep reinitiating new planning initiatives. We amended the Growth Management Act a number of times, but when it ultimately gets down to it, there is somehow a disconnect between really meaningful programs. And I grew up in South Florida. I can remember when we used to drive to the University of Miami from West Palm Beach to take my brother to see a speech therapist. That was the closest speech therapist. And we drove US 1 all the way. I remember when I grew up in West Palm Beach and the movie Ben-Hur came out, we had to go to Miami Beach to see it because there was no theater large enough, with a large enough screen to see it north of that. And we've changed. So what I got from Diamond's book was, how does a modern society choose to succeed? And the only way I know it can do it is through planning. And that thought gave new meaning to me in terms of what planning's real role is. It is an institutional way by which societies can choose, can identify their opportunities and choose to succeed, as opposed to ignoring and not succeeding by default. And so the mission or the importance or the value of planning was suddenly, to me, elevated way beyond what it has been traditionally in the state of Florida, which is basically a framework for land development regulations. And I said to myself, how can we allocate our resources, land, water, and others, our built environment, et cetera, if we don't know where we're going? If we haven't made a choice of what we need to do to survive and succeed. That leads me to have some pretty radical thoughts about the role of what planning is and can be in our society. And I've come to the conclusion that if we don't learn to plan for the future, we're unlikely to have one that's meaningful. And it spreads across our landscape. There was an article in the New York Times, an opinion piece in which someone was criticizing the whole issue about federal deficit control and how to cut. And this columnist said, how can you make these decisions which will affect this nation's future for perhaps ever without a plan of what you're going to cut, why you're going to cut, and what are the consequences of those cuts? And so this lack of planning, the discipline of collecting information, analyzing it on an objective and professional and measured basis is, I think, pervasive in our society. And it's not just the Growth Management Act that's a victim of it. It's in many ways our future. Now, I need to warn you all that I was originally trained as an ecologist in both undergraduate and graduate school. And I often wish that as a planner I would approach it as the study of human ecology, because I think the systems analysis that underlies the ecological analysis and principles that guide how we manage those environments plays out awfully well when you talk about a complex animal, the human being, in its environment, its habitat, the places that we all live and build. And that infects what I do. It also, I'm, as a biologist, a fan of Darwinian principles of survival. And there are a couple of things that really touch me and I want to share. One is that my favorite Darwin quote is, "It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. it's the one that is most adaptable to change. And change is a unique phenomena in the planning context. It's how I believe human beings can deal with the global economy and how they can choose to succeed. They have to be adaptable and they need to change to be so. But it's ironic that in the land use context, almost all of it is about resisting change. Most of our plans, unfortunately, are reverse engineered to our existing landscape. We protect what we have, and we suspect almost routinely any change. But yet change is the instrument of adaptability, and adaptability is the absolute key to survival in the long run. So I'm troubled by that. I'm also troubled by, my father was a retail merchant, and he was one of the best planners I ever knew. He applied planning principles to running a business, and he did a wonderful job. And it's remarkable to me that somehow planning has become viewed as anti-business, as anti-economic. I think without planning, the economy is in serious troubles because we're not going to use our resources wisely if we don't understand what are the consequences of those the matters in which we do that. And the disconnect between the process of planning in the business world and the process of planning in the rest of the world is really hard for me to understand, and how we have fallen prey to that. And it's an article of faith in the business community that they plan. And this is a quote from one business methodologies book. A plan is an important aspect of business and serves three critical functions. It helps management to clarify, focus, research their business or project's development and prospect, provides a considered and logical framework within which a business can develop and pursue business strategies in the future, and it offers a benchmark against which actual performance can be measured and reviewed. Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing when we plan for the future of our communities? And how is it that we have become, in the Chamber of Commerce's view of the state, anti-business, anti-success? My early focus, as I said earlier, was on the relationship between a plan and zoning. Zoning in the absence of a plan, I think, has little chance of being meaningful in the society. My late partner, Dick Babcock, my partner, Wendy Larson, here is in the audience, and Dick was our mentor. Dick used to say to anybody who would listen that 50% of every zoning ordinance in the country is of no useful purpose. It's there because somebody else used to do it. He had, Frank will remember his remark about zoning and its triviality was the egregious invalidity of the single-family detached dwelling district. And is there regulation after regulation around this country that says you've got to have a 30 or a 50-foot front yard setback? What useful purpose is that serve? I love to ask planners during the qualifications of when they qualify somebody as an expert, I love to ask them the question, would you please explain to me, if you're a planning professional, what the public purpose is in having a 30-foot front yard setback in this single-family district? Now, nobody ever objects. They just let them go on, and there is no answer. I mean, all it does is double the inefficiency of the land layout and the consumption of precious resources. I've been a critic of planning, just as I've been an advocate of planning, but it's how we do it, not the importance of it. So when I think about what we should be doing, I have to focus, or I have to look at, why doesn't the existing system do what we need? And it's amazing that in this nation where I've had the opportunity to practice around the country, I'm always asked about Florida. Their system has been regarded all my career as a landmark and pioneering effort. And in this state, it's been belittled, it's been ignored, and most recently disassembled. That disconnect, when people call me, when Bob Yarrow called me when he read about the legislative action, he couldn't believe what had happened. It was so alien to his part. We had Tom Pelham here, and for those of you who didn't see Pelham's speech, I thought lecture was really great. But the bottom line of what Tom said was that the state never gave planning a chance. I was a research clerk for the Elms Committee in 1973 and 4. There were recommendations that were sent to the legislature for funding the first round of mandatory planning. The sum was an outlandish sum to me, just recently graduated from law school, but in retrospect was a modest investment in the future of the city. The legislature passed the act ultimately in 75, but ignored, for all practical purposes, the funding that was necessary to bring local governments, to give them the resources to do a serious plan that would really make a difference. And it happened over and over again, the state comprehensive plan, the concurrency funding that was required to make that system work. And so Tom helped me to see that, in fact, it's not just adopting the system, but it's also giving it the resources it needs. And so I agree with Tom, but I think it goes further than that. I think that substantively, Florida's system fell into the trap of focusing on land use and not the greater good, the more holistic components of communities. And because Florida's economy was largely real estate development or agricultural use of land, it's not surprising that while the legislation may have been pioneering, the commitment to support it and fund it has not proven to be as great as we want. But the plan didn't have what I believe must be at the core of any successful plan for a community, no matter what geographical scale it is an economic plan for the future. Because if your economy is not sustainable, you can zone like crazy. You can reduce or whatever lot size or regulations you want. And how can you decide what kind of housing you need? I mean, the city of Boca Raton, where I live now, has a terrible problem at one hand. It's very attractive, wonderful Arvida developments in the 60s and 70s. It supported IBM and its growth to 12 or 14,000. And then IBM left town. And nothing filled that vacuum. In the meantime, Boca kept building units, but they built units for people who were retirees, not people who work for a living. And so now we're in a situation where a new job holder in the city of Boca Raton has to commute, on average, 19 miles to a place of affordable housing that they can afford on the jobs which are available in our community. The impacts of that on and Boca Raton's economic prospects are right now is that Boynton Beach is eating our lunch. Because it's so much closer to those places of employment. They actually have it in the west part. And so there's been this misalignment because nobody's really focused on what we need as a broad community. So I think you have to start for any meaningful plan with an economic element, which really drives everything. And that wasn't in our plan. And we zoned for what, in the absence of that driving part, we zoned for what people wanted, to preserve what they want, not to attract and promote what we want in the future. Another limiting factor is I don't know how local government can play a meaningful role over time in planning unless there is a state plan that has a geographic base about what the state's going to be when it grows up. They control so much of what we all do in terms of infrastructure and taxation and policy and program. And look at Palm Beach County several years ago. Palm Beach County was a faithful adherent of the concept of Eastward Ho, and then the state decided that we ought to have a Scripps Institute in South Florida, and that it ought to be in Palm Beach County. And all of a sudden, a grove out in the middle of nowhere became the destination for the Scripps Institute. Now, the law prevailed over politics. But the reality is if the state isn't using its resources in a way, its state functional agencies aren't acting in concert towards some desired and identifiable and measurable objective, how can local government play its part? I mean, and it's again get relegated to what is the building pretty, not whether it attracts the kind of jobs we need to succeed in the future. And I think it's important to, or at least to me, it's important to recognize that historically planning didn't have to deal with these global issues. Planning, you could manage land use and control much of your future, even as late as the Chicago plan, because of the limitations of transportation and mobility. And in the 1700s, you planned for how far you could walk or ride a cart, and it was easy. You could control land use, and it did it all. Today, when things are fleeting across in optical circuits at micron levels, that it's not that way anymore. It's really the substance that needs to be focused on, and it seems to me that that is an extremely important matter we have to do. I mentioned earlier the Noble Plan, and I've come to the conclusion that the Growth Management Act and its dependence, or its being the purview of so much politics, both at the legislative level and then at the local level, really resulted in what I call little plans. There is no place in that political environment for the long-term view. I can't remember whether Jim was in Tallahassee for the debate over the consistency provision of the original act. There was a fairly virulent opposition to it, and it was drawn from a book written by Joe Demento, and in which Joe basically took the position that really, while he understood the theory that Haar and Babcock and others had argued about that zoning ought to be in accordance with planning, that planning just wasn't up to the job. And he wrote that the planning process is costly, conservatively, and highly subjective. In addition, the actors who plan, not only the professional planners, but those who are involved in the most advanced participatory schemes, are incompetent to plan. Citizens are ignorant of means-ends relationship and are unwilling to make long-range decisions. When they do take action, the results tend to be poor. The legislature saw fit to ignore those who felt that consistency would not be success. But as I said earlier, I think that the lack of support, material support, and the substantive shortcomings of what we called plans really came back to hurt us. The general public doesn't understand what we do, and it seems to me plans ought to be instruments of education, educating people that they contribute to the traffic. We have all kinds of retirees in this community who go to early bird specials every day and then complain about the traffic. They could modify their behavior if they don't like the traffic instead of complaining about it and choose to go to dinner either closer to home or to work. But they think they have a God-given right to go wherever they want and wherever they can. Nobody can afford that. We can't afford that. We can't afford level of service A or B or C or D or E. We can barely afford 100% consumption of the available capacity. But yet we ignore these realities. I think plans, as I said earlier, have to be aspirational, and they should not be limited to the scope of land development regulations and their reach. And I think that lack of aspiration and the limitation to our current resources. If we limit our plans, our vision, our hope, our aspirations to what we have today, that's all we'll ever have is what we have today. If we want to do better, we've got to create some way of going further. I think that too often plans and planning, and I draw a distinction because they're both important. The planning process is vital to serving that educational role. Plans are important as monuments and aspirational instruments of policy and direction, but they're both important, and they're important because the planning needs to continue. I look back on the ear-based process with great regret, because everybody adopted the plan and then put it in the shelf for 7 years, and then they looked at it again instead of having what they needed to be doing is constantly using planning to apply it and to implement it instead of turning it over to just. So I wrote, in my view, planning and plans under the existing regime are too often made by planners for other planners more to satisfy statutory requirements and administrative rules than to, quote, aim high in hope and work. And I believe if we're going to have a new generation of plans that really make a difference, they have to adhere to that. The worst handicap that our system operates under are our local and state politics. The menu or the recipe is set by politicians, which is, I described the Florida legislature a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, there were a couple of legislators in the audience, so I paid a little price. But I said it was a bizarre bazaar, a B-I-Z-Z-A-R-R-E, and bazaar, B-A-Z-A-A-R. The reality is our politics have become special interest politics, and it's the influence of all kinds of things. It's the nature of the beast. To pretend that it's different and to not take it into consideration when you look to something new and better in the future, I think would be a mistake. And I believe that to have a truly important plan that is aspirational, that does focus on the common good, it needs to have a sponsor who is not politically beholden, that's elected every year or whatever. And I am a big fan, as some of you know, about the Regional Plan Association in New York and several other organizations around the country who have been able to play a real meaningful role as a non-traditional sponsor of planning initiatives. And I will come back to that in a moment. To be successful, to be noble, I believe plans need to be objective, merit-based, and balanced in the spirit of Burnham's enduring diagram. And there's a wonderful quote from the plan. This is from the original plan. The plan herein presented is the result of extended and careful study of the needs of Chicago made by disinterested men of wide experience, amid the very condition in which it is sought to remedy. And during the years devoted to the preparation of the plan has had the benefit of varied and competent criticism. Varied and competent criticism. We don't have that in our planning process. People don't go to the public hearings. When the plan is adopted, there are a few planners, a few land use lawyers in the audience. They come out for an issue after the plan has been adopted that is in their neighborhood. The reality is that also is that our public officials don't take the time to become educated. And we don't educate them as planners. And ultimately, they'll make a decision focused on a very short horizon, usually when they're going to next be elected or reelected. And that in Florida, because we do have rotation, many communities have an election every year. So there is never relief to do the business of the community. And finally, my view is that legislative reform is a long way off. It's going to be a generation before we see our state, or any state, I think, come together and really think hard and fast about what we need to do in order to be successful in the global economy. And it's just the nature of politics and history. And so if we're going to do something, I think it has to be something that's outside of the scope and direction of legislative initiatives. So I propose a new planning paradigm, and I assume I'm running out of time. Yep. And and I'm not suggesting a renovation of our existing system. I think that's fraught with peril. And so what I'm proposing is that we need a new independent application of planning practices to the needs of our states, and that we can't wait for elected officials and elected institutions, government, either the legislature or local governments, to do it. I propose a plan paradigm that contains the following elements. First, expanding the substantive scope to that first critical element. That is the economic element and what we need to do, whatever the planning unit, whatever it needs to do to succeed and participate in a global economy. Because we do live now in a global economy, whether you embrace Tom Friedman's words of the flat world, it's the reality. The startups and the ability to do things digitally fundamentally change the economics of land and where people want and will live. So I believe that that is the first and foremost element of a new plan paradigm. The second is the human capital necessary to participate in that global economy. And we, as a nation and as a state, are falling rapidly behind the economic success of this world. and we are fiddling while Rome is literally burning before our eyes. The third is that I think there has to ultimately be a state and regional and local allocation of responsibilities, not for the plan that we do, but the plan should anticipate that ultimately this planning paradigm would anticipate that that would be the response of an initiative. I think that the plan should be decoupled from zoning and land development regulations. It should be designed to be aspirational, and it shouldn't be limited by zoning. My view is that, as I've said, that they're reduced. I also think that by coupling it with land development regulations, we've given those who don't want planning or who have only their self-interest, we've given them ammunition to attack the concept of planning and characterizing as anti-development. I think that implementation of the plan should not be just by land development regulations. It should be by all means, and it should be by investment. It should be by individual responsibility. It should be diverse and agnostic, and it should be first and foremost, be investment-based and individual behavioral-based. Individual responsibility, I think, is really important. We can do so many things if we just educate ourselves and then personally behave and teach our friends and educate people to understand. I love this quote, "Let everyone sweep in front of his own door and the whole world will be clean." We don't do that in our plans. We don't educate people. We don't explain it to them in a way that they can respond to. I also believe that plans need to be more reliant on the power of the idea. There are few ideas in our society these days, and I believe that an idea which is aspirational, which explains, which is a goal that people can achieve, that people can grab onto it. Victor Hugo said, "There's one thing stronger than all the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come." It won't solve all our problems, but you won't find many ideas in many plans these days. But if you go read the Chicago plan, you'll see a lot of ideas. Not all of those ideas became reality, but an awful lot of them served to motivate people to play things in a different way. It's got to be pro-economic. As I said, it's got to focus on it. And Alexander Garvin, a noted architect and planner, wrote that his definition of successful city planning, and I don't understand why people don't get this: public action that generates a desirable, widespread, and sustained private market reaction. Our plans have to do that if we're going to be successful going forward. We need to replace the C words of the existing system, consistency, compliance, and concurrency, with a new set of words, all C words: collaboration, coordination, and creativity. It needs to be positive. Planning and plans, in my view, have to be institutions of education. They need to teach people and explain, and they need to inspire individual behavior and collective behavior that will further the cause. I think a truly noble plan must be, first, liberated from politics and special interests. That limits who can be the sponsor. Second, it's got to be presented in plain terms. You can't educate people who are uneducated in planning terms if you use planning jargon. You need to do it in terms that people can understand. And your target are affected and interested persons and elected and appointed officials. It's got to be grounded in objective analysis and creative solution. And you need to not worry about how it's going to be, whether or not anybody's going to embrace it in the next year or 2 or 10 years. Remember the noble diagram, put it out there. And if it's a good idea, it will find its own way. Ultimately, a political discourse that is going on under our existing paradigms will raise a question, and someone will answer it by referral to that noble diagram, as I call it. So now a call for action. Talk is cheap. And I think we need a new paradigm. We've called it Planning 2.0. I think we need it now. I think we're really at a turning point. The intersection of the collapse of the real estate industry, which has exposed the vulnerability of our society, the 50 years of growth that we've consumed, most of the easy, low-hanging land. We're now taking lands that are more important for other purposes in order to generate more new product. and we need to become competitive in that new economy that's emerging out there. I don't understand why our comprehensive plans, both state, regional, and local, don't focus on the gigantic market that just sits so Latin America, South America from here. There are almost 400 million people in a growing economy down there. And our desire lines in terms of producing goods and services should be, in that economic element, should be focused on reaching out to them instead of trying to go to the Me Too's to China and India and Japan. So I think the time is now. I think it's not an exaggeration to describe Florida as sort of a Colorado mining town on steroids. Our mines were converting raw land into first wetlands into agricultural fields and then agricultural fields into subdivisions. We've largely done that in South Florida. What are we going to do next? We've got to create a new economy. And that's something today. Every year that somebody is out of the marketplace, out of the economy, it takes 5 years to come back. And we're giving up time that's problematic. I think that Florida Planning 2.0 has merit. And if it has those substantive elements we've talked about, I think it can make a difference. It will influence other planning initiatives. It will provide an objective if it's presented by the right people. Ideally, we'd have a regional plan association. If we had an institution that was over 90 years old that had helped to, through its advocacy and its leadership and its planning, generated $100 billion in infrastructure and investment, as they've done in the New York metropolitan area during their history, they would do that for us. They would have done it for us. But the trouble is there isn't an organization here, and the time it takes to put it together, I believe the opportunity will be largely gone. So we need the alternative, a non-traditional sponsor, and it's not governed by an elected body because you've got to get the politics out of it. It needs to be explicitly organized for the common good. You can't make an animal be something that it's not. And so it has to be something that institutionally, organically is designed for the common good. It has to have diverse intellectual and technical capabilities funded for the common good. It needs to be experienced in rigorous research because that's what it takes to learn the lessons to help society choose to succeed in the future. It needs to be skilled at teaching. One of our biggest failings in planning is we do not teach the people who are affected. If people understood the true relationship between their behavior and the cost to society, I believe that their individual behavior would change and it would have a dramatic impact on the success of our communities in so many different ways. And it has to have intrinsic integrity. And as I look around, there are just not many institutions that can do that. And frankly, the only one I can think of in the near term is the university in the broader sense. It has all those resources. And because the plan is not a legal instrument, because nobody is obligated to follow it, it becomes that idea, that noble diagram that other well-meaning people and other systems can embrace, can borrow from, can learn from. And if it's done right, like the RPA has done it in New York, is continued to supplement it with studies, 120 major programs over the years they've been in existence. How better to teach students to be productive citizens to participate in a non-traditional planning process like this. But the university is just a good starting place. It can't do two of the things that the RPA does. The second thing that the RPA does is that they raise funds to support these initiatives. While the university is doing lots of things, if it became the sponsor of a non-traditional plan, it's going to need additional resources. And those additional resources are only going to come from the people who benefit. In New York, the people who benefit are all the major corporations in the region, all the nonprofit groups. So somewhere along the line, there needs to be created a Florida Planning 2.0 plan alliance or association to play that role. Someday, the development community, Peter, you're listening, has got to wake up to investing in a non-traditional plan for their region. If you take the city of Boca Raton, the decline in property values that have occurred over the last 4 years because Boca's plan is no longer relevant to the economy we live in. It's about $4 billion worth of real estate value that's been lost. And they won't wisely. They're not going to give it to the city to modify their plans. But some portion of that contributed to the Regional Plan Association in New York has made all the difference in the world. And in fact, it's been leveraged. They have a $5 million annual budget. They limit it to $50,000 per sponsor because they want it to be objective. They want no entity to control the outcome. And then there's got to be an advocacy organization. The university can't be that advocate. It needs to maintain its integrity. And so there needs to be, in conjunction with this program, an advocacy function. I believe that the second and the third parts would come if the initiative were supported. Now, this planning initiative I'm talking about is planning as a system. But it seems to me that South Florida is a perfect laboratory to test it, and that either this university or this university and other universities has an opportunity to use all the resources. You have remarkable resources to start a process and to start building success, and recognizing that the objective is not a plan which you then go, okay, we did it. It's a planning process that will periodically throw off products that address either major or smaller issues that collectively make up that vision for the South Florida, and that we could test this hypothesis, which I've advocated here, and find out whether it can really work. Is there an imperative within the community? Is there a willingness to participate that can make a difference? Now, I guess, should I run through I lost my last page? And we propose to do this. I've lost it. Here it is. Here it is. 2-inch paper. First thing we need to do is solicit members of the planning community to participate in this effort. It needs to be successful. It needs a body of people to participate, and to be evangelists that there is a better, there can be a better way, and that it can make a difference, and that we're involved and want to participate. And that's really critical to doing. And if we can't spread the word, if we can't get people involved, we would then prepare a work program. And it's going to be a long-term work program. We're going to be able to bite off what we can do in the near term and then build on that going forward in the future. We're going to have a major symposium in March to reflect on this and to kick it off. And then we'll commence work, at least starting the process, hoping that others will join with us in doing it right after the March symposium, and then work to establish that plan association institution to be to work with the community, to bring the private sector, to bring the nonprofit community, to bring interested public officials who are willing to step back from the existing tradition and participate, and then finally create that advocacy program that would be independent but would come together to support an advocate for a different way. So I believe that this is something that can be achieved, and as I said, I feel that we're not talking about reforming anything. We're talking about redefining what planning's role is in our society, and doing a demonstration project to prove that there is another way and that planning can be made meaningful in producing plans. What is made of those plans will depend upon other things, but my concern is that we don't produce those plans. We don't produce those noble diagrams, and so, as Tom Pelham said, we never really give planning a chance. So thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much, Charlie. Before I'm going to ask Jim to give a first response, I want to show you this thing what Charlie yesterday called creating the intellectual infrastructure. I actually thought it was a really interesting way of thinking about what the next step would be. So on January 18, we have another lecture. It's the Planner as Persuader, utilizing maps and graphics. And we're going to have Will Sonneveld from the University of Delft over here to explain to us how to do this. Oops, that went way for the... Okay. Basically, what I was trying to show here, I'm like, wait a second, where did these come from? These are different ways, you know, the traditional, what I said, GIS is kind of making us not very creative. This was a different way of thinking about transportation. It actually shows you that it takes 2 hours and 22 minutes to go from Palm Beach State College to Florida Atlantic University by public transit. It takes 30 minutes by car. At that same time, you can fly to Montreal, New York, Dallas, Mexico City. The point here was that we want to show you that the way we tell the story as planners makes a difference. This is way more convincing than just talking about that we don't have a very good transit system. Anyway, so that's what I hope he can help us with a little bit. The next one is February 22nd. We're going to have featuring Alan Thierstein, who wrote a book, or edited a book, Imaging the Reason. And he's going to talk mostly about value-added planning. What does that mean? How do you do that? And again, the intent is that we create some common knowledge about these things. And then finally, March 21st, we're going to have the Florida, I call it the Florida Planning 2.0 Symposium. We don't know exactly what it will look like yet, but the intent is that we have either a half-day or a day-long event. We're really going to try to flush this out with a larger group of people. We're going to try to invite some good people to help us with this. Maybe we could Pelham back, maybe we could Garo back, maybe invite some other people, and then really try to get some action plan about how to do this next. Did that cover everything, Charlie?
Mm-hmm.
All right, with that, I'm going to give Jim the difficult task here to give an initial response. Jim, of course, former DCA secretary, director of Q's here for a while, actually for a fairly long time. And then he went to the Regional Planning Council, where he became the project director for the HUD grant. And I think is it now the director or the interim director of the Regional Planning Council?
I'm never sure.
Okay, well then I don't feel so bad about it. Jim Merlin.
Thanks, Job. It's a pleasure to be able to be here with you tonight and to always hear the interesting and provocative comments that Charlie comes up with. I want to say right off the bat that I'm really happy that the university and the school and the college found its way to understand that the DeGrove chair, the Eminent Scholars Chair, was not meant just for academics, but for practitioners. And I can't think of a better person to be in that, to have that honor.
Thank you.
Our mutual friend would be very pleased to know that that's the case. So Charlie and I have been doing this kind of planning stuff way too long, and we want to, I guess, share our wisdom. But when I look out in that audience, I see a lot of faces younger than ours, Charlie. It's going to be you that do this, and so take that. I mean, when we were at our prime 30 years ago, we were going to doing the things that you're going to have to do, and I just think that's most important. And I want to both respond and give you the context for my response from that perspective. It's so important for the generation that's here today to take up the leadership role. Okay, planning. I came out of planning in school and law school and into many different opportunities to exercise that with an idealistic view of it. And I would sit here tonight and say that now I come to appreciate that planning is just as messy and political and difficult to define as everything else that we do in our democracy. That's just it. I mean, we are not a parliamentary form of government. We're a democracy. We have a federal government that can be all over the place, but basically takes care of taxation, defense, infrastructure, and taxation, which may be the most important instrument they have available to them to help us at the state and regional local level. What they do with their tax code is probably more important than anything else. But they're part of the planning that affects all what we do. And the states were always seen as a place where there'd be innovation. That didn't mean that they would innovate, but they could innovate. And we have seen states historically do that. And I think Florida has tried to be that, one of those states. And then local governments have been doing planning forever, since we've had, local governments, towns in New England using the residents themselves to make those planning decisions. And in a sense, we're still there. That's still the model we have. And I really don't expect it to change much. I think local governments are going to be very protective of their citizens. States are going to be involved in the processes that they have been involved in historically, and the same is true for the federal government. I do believe, after my 30 years of experience, that the opportunity for creativity does exist at the regional level, and that's where I think we share part of our experience and a way of looking forward. Let me say right off the bat what I worry about with the essence of Charlie's model. And I think the model in complementing other public-led activities can be successful. But I don't think it can lead. I don't think in this in the kind of government we lead in that an elite form of looking at planning, and that's what the RPA is. It's a bunch of people who are elitists who think that they can create a noble plan. And I think that the messengers make a difference in our government and in our community and how decisions are made. And those aren't the right messengers, especially in Florida, where we're not blessed with 200 years of leadership of large corporations and families and other institutions. We're very much on the edge of creating those things, and we're much more diverse as a population. I simply don't think that model alone can lead us into the next paradigm we need. I think it can complement other things, but I think that the messenger makes a difference on some of these issues, and I don't think in today's world that model works. On the other hand, I would raise this other sort of dichotomy that I hear Charlie talk about, because Charlie has identified some things that he sees as models, and then he puts it in the context of what the state does or didn't do. I don't think when Burnham did the plan for Chicago, he cared less what was happening in Illinois. And I don't think that the RPA that is essentially set up to worry about what happens in the land use plan for Connecticut, or for that matter, the land use plan for New York. They're very much oriented towards a city and a metropolitan area that is driven by economic activity. That's the key thing that they looked at 100 years ago. I think it's the key thing we have to look at today. But where I would part with Charlie, and where my 30 years of experience of trying to do state planning is, we just need to work around the state. We just need to assume that that's an historic construct that isn't going to play a positive role in our moving Southeast Florida forward. I mean, when Disney came here to Great Disney World, he didn't worry about, Orlando or Orange County or he just went to he created his own world separate by getting the legislature to empower it. Now, and I assume that Southeast Florida, as we proceed, will need that kind of special enabling authority from Tallahassee, so we can't divorce ourselves. But I don't think the solution is in spending a lot of time worrying about whether or not the state comprehensive planning law works. It was a point in time in the evolution of planning in Florida, and I participated in it. I advocated for it, and I still think it was of value. But it's at the state level, I feel its time has probably passed. And our focus and energy and resources should be working at the regional level. I think a place that I would also agree in part with what Charlie was talking about, more than in part, I would emphasize it. I think it's key, and I just, I meant to alluded to it, is the importance of tying what we're doing to economic development. And we failed to do that, as Charlie pointed out, in the history of doing the local comp plans. It exists, their opportunity was there. It was an optional element to the comp plan. But I must give you a personal experience. In Palm Beach County, about 5-10 years ago, I was working with their Office of Economic Development, and they had a comp plan element for economic development. And when we took an honest look at it, we found out it was more a constraint on economic development than it was an avenue forward. And that they were better off eliminating that and having a very much more flexible, fluid, and dynamic economic strategy that they could relate to their comp plan. But the focus there had to be with their business community and the local government, who had to make the decisions on infrastructure. And it was a different kind of plan that we do and put into an element of our comprehensive plan. So I came away from that experience thinking that it's not inserting it in the comp plan, it's creating a different kind of economic development strategy for both local and regional areas that complements the comp plan. Charlie's alluded to, and I am fortunate at the Regional Planning Council to be working with our region to the north, Treasure Coast, in a multi-county experiment, an effort to look at regional planning over a 2-year period and see if we can come up with some recommendations that would take us to another planning level. It is publicly directed at this point because it was a grant from the federal government to a regional agency. So we bear the burden of convincing the private sector and the civic world that this is an effort worthy of their attention, and that's what we've been working on as we organize this effort. When we put the first grant application material together to receive the funds, it looked like the grant and the outcome, the deliverable, looked like any standard Florida plan. It was elements, you could have written it yourselves if you're familiar with the Florida Growth Management Law. And we got the award on that. And within 6 months, we realized that what we committed to do with HUD was not relevant in the world that we were going to be operating in the next 5 years. And so we've changed that kind of traditional planning process into creating an economic blueprint for the prosperity of the region. It is oriented and focused on economic development as the thing that brings us together. So I think that's a very important part of the orientation that we need to have as we go forward. I would agree with Charlie on that. The new planning paradigm that we're seeing that's going to be necessary at the regional level, and again, our focus will be on the region and the tools and directions that are going to be needed for that, for this 7-county area, which has a population today of 6.2 million people, which is larger than 35 states, is an entity that can compete in the global environment. I couldn't agree more that that's the context from which we should see our success. We are already connected globally more than any other region in Florida, and probably within the top 5 around the country, because those travel distances that Yacht put up there are indicative of the fact that most of our travel connections are going internationally, not domestically, and that we have a great economic competitive advantage because of the international diversity that we have currently available in the region, and we need to build on that. It's those connections from family and culture and businesses back to other countries that create the trade relationships that we're going to deal with as we move in the future. So that's a really big plus and competitive advantage that we need to take advantage of as we move forward. We conceive that the structure we'll need at the regional level will have at least these two components, and actually, as I sat and listened to Charlie, I think that what he's proposing could easily be added to that. It could be a 3-part solution. if you look at Southeast Florida today, at the regional level, there's at least 10 or 12 agencies, almost all doing relatively the same thing. And they're all reading the same U.S. Census data. And they're all, there's just so many different things that you can do repeatedly at each agency. And this is basically the transportation planning and activities, the 2 regional planning councils, much of the work that goes on in economic development. What we think is possible, and I can't tell you, I can't wave a magic wand and see it happen, but what we think is possible on the public level side of this equation is that we at least create, with the limited resources that are out there, a more effective and efficient planning structure for the public to look at these regional issues. We may not, it's not about consolidation as much as it is being more effective on how we apply for our staff resources. If we still have the same number of decision-making bodies, that wouldn't be as far as I'd like to go, but I could be satisfied if they were pretty much supported by a consolidated staff. If we're going to continue to have 5 MPOs, we can have 1 staff supporting 5 MPOs instead of 5 staffs. And that same 2 staffs could support the 2 regional planning councils. We could then really generate the kind of professional capability at that level, which I think would enhance the process. It's just a step. I'd like to see more consolidation of the decision-making bodies, but those are the really hard nuts to crack. The other piece that we envisioned that was going to be necessary for this planning process that we're working on to be successful is that we need a very strong advocacy group. And we would contemplate there a much stronger business-oriented group that could take many of its parallels to some of the things Charlie talked about, and see if, and that's the group, because the government, again, the messengers make a difference. When you go to Tallahassee and Washington to go after those scarce resources, it's not the government messengers that make a difference. It's not the civic messengers that make a difference. It's not the university messengers that make a difference. It's the business community. And if they're on the same page with a strategic regional set of priorities, then we have a chance over a number of years to fund the kind of really game-changing investments that we need to make in this region. And not just infrastructure investments, but investments in education and the environment and other human resources that are necessary for a successful region. It just doesn't happen on an annual cycle of budget making at any level of government. It takes place over numerous years. And to do that effectively, we need a strong business-oriented organization that's willing to support that message and to tell the legislatures, quite frankly, this is part of the way you win our support at the local level and campaign contributions and other ways. There's no reason why what Charlie has suggested, perhaps housed at the university, couldn't complement that. I don't think, though, standing alone, from my perspective and from my experience, that it could stand alone and do that. It could be a very strong complement to these other key pieces that I'm talking about, and that, frankly, I can't, again, wave a magic wand and tell you they're going to exist. That's what I hope happens as the outcome of this 2-year process that we're about to engage in. So I see room for that, but I think it's a big challenge for the universities to do this. They don't have a track record to date of being able to do it, and they are under severe financial pressure to deal with their chief function, which is education and research. And to be able to pull off this other thing with resources would be a major challenge, because the first things that go in budget times are usually these external-oriented activities. I can personally attest to that. So, but I don't think it's not impossible. I just think that the track record has demonstrated so far that it's not. I don't think it's one university. I definitely think it's an opportunity for a consortium of universities to work on. So I am enthused with the ideas that Charlie shared. I think we probably can stand several innovative efforts taking place, and not just one, because I have no way of knowing which one's going to be more effective. And I think that we need to collaborate as we move them forward. So I hope that we have the kind of support for the kinds of things that Charlie's talking about. But I would just end by where I began. Don't set your expectations so high that you're only going to find a feeling of sort of failure, because it's like thinking that we're going to have the perfect income tax. We're not. It's a function of our form of government, and the same is going to be true of planning. It has its roots in our form of government, and that's exactly how we're going to be as we move forward. Thanks, Al.
Thank you. I would love to let you react, Charlie, but I'm not going to let you. Because I know nobody would be able to ask any questions if we would do that. So, anybody, any questions or comments? You want to respond then, Charlie? All right.
Carla? No.
I'm just curious.
Well, I'm curious about what your first step is. You want to go down this road. What's the first step you want to take?
So the question was, what's the first step? Because nobody else can hear it. So
the first step would be to solicit the support of members of the planning community who are interested in trying a different way. And I tried to outline in my remarks why I'm a pessimist that our even the best efforts of doing effectively the same thing again are not going to produce different results. And I guess I'm too old. I've been through 5 cycles or 4 cycles of we're going to do this and do it better. But my first step would be to try to solicit a group of people to participate, then to organize a work program, and then to start picking off that work program on a piece-by-piece basis. And I would start with the economic element because I think there's a lot of resources available. There are other people are thinking about this all through the region. And I believe that you could assemble those pieces and start building some credibility, the ability to produce useful information. An important part that I may not have made clear is that I believe that that this objective source of analysis, information and analysis on planning matters in the broader sense can support the kind of initiatives that Jim is involved in, support the traditional planning programs by providing a more holistic and a more noble description of what we can be. And I believe that is an important role in understanding where we're going and making our existing political institutions. They're not going away. It's but to give people ideas that they can refer to. And while we don't have an RPA now, I believe that we need one. And I believe that it needs to be a regional focus. But I don't think we'll get there without proving the merits of an independent, objective analysis freed from political influence and the taint of government and the limitations of bureaucracy, et cetera. And that's why I've described what I think the non-traditional sponsor would be. I'd love to have an RPA. I have a more positive attitude. I think the RPA has been a very effective means of providing what is regarded as objective analysis of the needs of the region, and that has been used by all kinds of persons in going through the normal political process. And my concern is that when we get through making plans, and it's just history, the fact of the matter is they don't survive politics. I was the lead consultant on the state plan, redevelopment plan in the state of New Jersey. By far, I believe, the best state plan that's ever been produced. And as long as it remained in effect, There were major functional state agencies that were made billions of dollars invested in appropriate things, but it ultimately died because it was an instrument of the political system. It died an ignominious death. And so what I'm trying to do, and that's why I emphasize planning as well as plans, to create to find a paradigm that would allow the aspirational qualities of plans, free of the limitations of politics and existing finance, et cetera, that can educate people who care about their communities. And so the first thing I do is do the first element. I think a lot of people in the community would like to have for the general public understand what the real realities of our economic prosperity. We can all talk. All of us planners know where we ought to be focusing. But it doesn't make a bit of difference unless the people who actually elect officials, et cetera, and that's the aspirational quality of a plan that I think can be created. And if it's created outside of the political construct, I think it can have weight and merit over time. And I think it supports Jim. I think it builds what he needs more than anything is a constituency other than other planners. And that's, I think, and developers. Because just because a developer thinks it's a great idea, it's necessarily a bad idea with the rest of this community. And it's overcoming some of that, and it's going to take a long time. But if you pick off pieces, if you start with a framework, and some of the stuff that Jaap has introduced me to that's done in Europe and other places, not hidebound by the ultimate conviction that whatever I do in a plan is going to turn into a regulation I'm not going to like. Makes it very difficult for people to have an open mind, and that's a part of what we're doing. I am going to produce a paper on this that will be available before the March event, in which there's a significant amount of analysis in detail and examples that will, I think, help elucidate this proposal. But I would not suggest in any way that you don't keep doing everything we're doing and try to do it as hard. The objective is to have some responsible planning in place over time.
Okay, I saw two more questions. I know a bunch of you need to go to class, so if you just want to walk out and run, go ahead.
Okay, the new European model is less is more in terms of planning. Less is more. And less means economic competitiveness and investment, period. No land use discussion at all. And the second thing is that calls for sort of a new set of skills that planners don't have. We've sort of trained people to be land use development planners. We need to train them to be economic development planners.
Agreed.
All right, anybody else? Yep.
This question is for Charlie. I have as far as private funding is concerned and economic development, what sectors do you think we should approach first for funding? Should it be a technology company, or maybe I should look more into the Northeast and what they've done? But what sectors do you think down here would be the first ones to support?
Well, I think the big sectors that I see that have future are technology firms. We still have a significant number of technology firms. They have a strong interest in growing the attractiveness to South Florida for highly skilled workers. We still have some cost advantages over other regions that specialize in high tech. I think there are a lot of existing institutional investors that own a ton of space that has limited prospects in the future, and those prospects would be enhanced by a meaningful focus on the future, the economy, and what it takes to compete in the global economy, and so they are logical. I think traditional developers are not the source. I think that there is a taint that comes with them, unfortunately, even though they ought to have the same kind of interest that the institutional investors have. I think there's some large landowners who still hope that there are future opportunities, and I think that they have a real meaningful role to play in getting where we're going to go. And then I think there are associations of interests I mean, retailing's a big business here. Retailers don't look at themselves as an industry in the traditional sense of industries that support major public initiatives. But we have too much commercial retail floor area in South Florida already. Its value is going to plummet if our economy doesn't recover over time. And so they should have an interest in seeing a rational program, because it's got to ultimately lead into investment. I mean, we're not going to succeed at any of this crap unless we invest in our infrastructure in the future. And it's not just the physical infrastructure, it's the intellectual infrastructure we need to compete in the global economy. I mean, and that's, if there's a place where we're really weak, it's the disaggregation of our educational policy from our economic policy. That's just, I mean, and we have, right now, we have a part of the state that's talking about jobs, we need economic growth and development, and they're talking about restricting or reducing higher ed funding that could affect our ability to produce the kinds of technical skills that we need. I mean, we have some people in Boca Raton who are recruiting all over the country. That's all they do, and try to talk them into coming to Florida, and then they look around the kind of housing we have. They've had the experience. They grew up in New York. They've been going to school in California at Stanford or MIT, and they come down here and they say, "Why would I move here?" Because we just don't have those kinds of places that in our society, and right now, if you want to build one, it's pretty hard to get it done. You take months, and we've watched. I don't know if David's seen this, but we've watched who owns land in South Florida has changed over the last 5 years. The people we're talking to today, doing business with in our professional business, are not the local developers who've been building buildings. They are largely national companies representing institutional investors, and they have a very different perspective. And they have a horizon of allocating their resources in months, not years. And so the developers who slugged it out for 3.5 years to get some local government to do what the local government told them at the outset they wanted isn't going to happen anymore. It's not going to be acceptable. It's not going to be competitive. We're now in a situation in Florida competing with the rest of the world in the allocation of capital. And we're not doing a good job.
All right, I've been watching my phone here because I have a question. It's a 3-part question. I don't know where it came from, but it came from somebody who was watching online. The question is there regional leadership in South Florida? If so, where is it? And is it here? Meaning in this room.
Well, there's all kinds of leadership. I think Jim is a leader, and I think he's a proven leader. I think his success is often defined by the institution or other institutions who limit his opportunity to express those leadership. Are there major members of the business community who are actively out there campaigning? In Dade County, there's some leadership at the Beacon Council. I think it is looking at some holistic issues, but by and large, it's all about politics. It's not about leadership. It's my sad.
Well, yeah. I guess it's, if there's a point where I think politics is inherent in our system of government. So we can't avoid not looking for leaders there, and we may be, unfortunately, because some of the institutional things we've done to ourselves, like term limits, we make it harder for leaders to come forward in that area, and so in the end we may have to restructure that side of the equation to to make it happen. But we can't divorce ourselves from the fact that we will need to find those leaders within the political realm. They have to come out of the business community. I think that the top, the presidents of the universities should be much more involved leaders as they are in other regions. And I see that emerging, but I think if we can all, if the 2.0 program and our program and others can create a synergy among them so that they work as a team, we could, that there's a leadership capability there.
All right, if there's no other questions, please help me thank our speakers. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you on January 18, and I hope that the first step is to get some more people on board and support this.